Welcome back, everybody. Welcome, welcome. It often starts at the top. In our next session, we're going to explore how we can cultivate business leadership to affect awareness and solutions to climate change. Let us welcome to the stage Helen Bertelli. Helen is a 20-year veteran of marketing and public relations. She is also president of the award-winning agency Benecomms that specializes in the areas of sustainability and climate change, among many other sectors. She is also the founder of Women in Climate Tech, a fast-growing organization dedicated to elevating women's voices in the industry. Helen, welcome to the stage.
So this is definitely the biggest presentation I've ever done. So I have my iPhone with my notes. Thank you for bearing with me. And before I start, I wanted to shout out to my girls, Ava and Sophia. They are here, and they are my world, and they are the reason why I do this work. I love you guys. All right, here I am. So yes, I've been in communications my whole career. I started Benecomms in 2018 because I wanted to work on climate change. Didn't know if there was going to be anyone who was going to pay me to do that work. Turns out it worked out. We're growing really fast, and we've approached about a dozen people now, and we continue to grow. We've got amazing clients, many of whom are doing wonderful things in climate tech. So it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time to be working on this issue and seeing these remarkable and creative solutions coming to the fore. Oh, there I am. Okay. Now, when I began working in climate change, for the first time in my career, before this, I'd been doing a lot of work with large law firms, multinational law firms. And for the first time, I really started working with more women than I'd ever worked with before. So many women have been working in this space for many years. And so I was just going along doing my job, getting them speaking engagements and writing engagements. And one thing I heard over and over was, oh, I'm not qualified. And these are PhDs, these are scientists, and I'd be like, what? And it just struck me that it wouldn't be wonderful to have an organization where women could practice in a safe space, speaking. We could help them put their presentations together. After all, when you've done something like this, right, you say, oh, I survived. I can do this. Oh, my goodness. It changes everything. So that's initially how it started. We started off last year in 2020, and we've gradually built it and kind of pressed go in January, and it just took off like a rocket ship. I mention this for two reasons. First, you can join. It is free, womeninclimatetech.org, so please do. And number two, I'll be mentioning some of the research that we have conducted with our members. One of the things that I'm really excited about Women in Climate Tech is having these amazing sustainability officers, amazing people in technology working on this issue, coming together, and we survey them regularly to find out hiring trends, industry trends, information that it's very hard to get because it's still quite a fractured market. So yes, this is Women in Climate Tech. All right. The image on this slide is of melting glacial ice. And I'm going to use it a couple of times in the presentation, but I'm not going to use any other slides of polar bears and whatnot, and that's because you guys are here, and because you're here, I assume you know the score. I'm not focusing my presentation on how bad things are. I'm focusing on what we can do from here, and that's really my goal in this talk today. So, what are we going to do? Seeing as you know the score, you're likely to agree with this statement that what we're facing is the greatest exercise in change management the world has ever seen. Now, I realized this. I want to credit my friend Gina. She and I went to Climate Change Officers Conference several years ago, and we were having coffee in the airport afterwards. And she looked at me and she just goes, you know what, we'd had such an incredible time at this conference with these incredible climate change officers. And she said, you know, this is really a change management exercise. And it really struck a chord with me. Now, I've been an in-house marketer for many years in several different organizations, and anyone who's ever had a role like that knows that it's less about marketing and much more about herding cats. So change management and organizational development has always really interested me. So after this conversation with Gina, I set out to try and find a book on climate change management, organizational climate change management, and I couldn't find one. This was late last year. I don't know if anyone's written one yet, but as soon as I couldn't find one, I set about starting to write one. And the work that you see today is a result of that. The book is still in the works, but you're seeing a sneak peek. Okay, so in change management, you start out with the end in mind. There are so many commitments to date. The last speaker went through them, and it's an incredible number of companies are stepping up now, which is wonderful. Very, very ambitious goals. But they also mean that every role and every person and every organization around the world is going to have to play a part in this change. And that's a lot of cats to herd. So let's get started. I'm going to start off by talking a bit about the TCFD. You guys probably know about the TCFD, but I'm going to explain it anyway because it's useful to hear how I'm making a parallel between that and change management. It's a reporting framework that's taking off in finance. It's a way to enable investors to measure and manage climate change. I'm going to argue that this framework is essentially a change management vehicle. And it can be used by more than just the finance sector, more than just by external investors. In fact, it can be used inside of any company, inside of any community, or even a household to tackle climate change. So the TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, was born in 2015 and spearheaded by central banks and top financial institutions. These institutions essentially wanted a way to assess investments to know how they might be affected by climate change. The framework has since taken off and is being employed around the world, as you can see. In many jurisdictions, it's still voluntary, although that is changing fast. As we heard in the last presentation, the SEC will be coming out with a framework shortly. It's likely to be aligned to the TCFD or very similar. So this is a great model to know. We've been working on the TCFD now since about 2018, and it's going to become part of everyone's vernacular, I think, very soon. Okay, the TCFD encourages companies to assess and disclose their climate-related risks using 4 pillars that broadly represent how an organization operates. Governance, which is leadership. Strategy, is how a company plans to thrive in the future. Risk management, how a company tackles risk. Metrics and targets, what gets measured gets managed. And I want to call your attention to the circle on the top left. This is one of the ways the TCFD depicts a framework. And you'll see this again later in my presentation. The TCFD encourages companies to think about 2 broad types of risks. Physical risks, such as flooding, extreme heat, wildfire. Transition risks are losses and disruptions caused by the transition to a lower carbon economy. So take note of the transition risk concept. We'll come back to this as well. So as you can see, the concept of climate risk is central to the way the TCFD operates. And these screenshots from Google Trends show searches for the terms climate risk and TCFD has been rising sharply. Word is spreading. The concept of climate risk is interesting because whether or not you believe in climate change, it's not asking you to believe in climate change, it's asking you how much risk are you willing to bear is your company willing to bear on betting whether or not this is happening? So it changes the conversation. As a side note, many people in the climate community actually started using #climate risk because of the danger of using the hashtag climate change. We were actually told when we first started working in this field, don't use the term climate change, because all the haters come out. So we started using climate risk, and evidently everyone else in the community got the same memo. And I just find it so interesting that climate change denial may have inadvertently spawned a movement in communications that may have the power to squelch the denial. Let's talk about organizational change management. These are the opening words for Managing Transitions, Making the Most of Change, by William and Susan Bridges. They illustrate the book's central premise that change management is not a linear process with a beginning, middle, and end. It is instead something far more complex. And this is a very well-known book. It's very highly respected in business schools around the world. So this is what I read, and as I read the book, I thought through all my work in climate change and thought how the parallels were so remarkable. Okay, so Managing Transitions asserts that organizational change can be understood in 3 phases. Number 1, the first is letting go of old ways and old identity. During this time, people must grasp there is a need for change and deal with the grief or losses they feel as a result. Number 2, next comes the neutral zone. It's where the old is gone, but the new isn't yet operational. And critical reprogramming occurs at this stage. Managers must recognize the existence of the neutral zone and help their people navigate it, otherwise change will be derailed. And the final phase involves the development of the new identity and the discovery of a new purpose and a way forward, and this is where change takes flight. The point of this is that organizational change is extremely hard, extremely complex. To have a successful transition, you have to give the process time and resources it needs to play out. Otherwise, you risk failure, and as we know, failure is not an option. I want to draw your attention again to the transition risk reference from the TCFD. This is what helps investors look from the outside at a company to assess how it might be impacted by the transition to a low-carbon economy, as we discussed. So a company reliant on selling coal likely won't do well in the transition. An air conditioning company might, or it probably will. The argument I'm making is that the mode of assessing risk isn't just useful for outsiders, for investors. It's also useful internally when companies assess their own transition risks from within. Who are the winners and losers inside your company? What do they have to gain and lose for whatever transition you have to make? How can all the cats be herded? And just like any transition, company leaders need to understand that if external forces move you to transition before you're ready or too fast, like carbon pricing regulation that takes a coal company by surprise, the impact of a too swift transition can be catastrophic. The new beginning much harder to reach or impossible to reach. Companies that have not transitioned properly will be bankrupted. So in the final phase, the new beginning, is where the change gains traction. The work that needs to be done in this phase can be placed into 4 categories: purpose, picture, plan, and part. And I quote from the book, Managing Transitions, purpose. You can explain the basic purpose behind the outcome you seek. People have to understand the logic of it before they turn their minds to work on it. That's communications. Picture. Paint a picture of how the outcome will look and feel. People need to experience it imaginatively before they can give their hearts to it. Excuse me. So what does net zero actually mean to an average person in a cubicle? That's fundamentally the question, and the leaders have to make it real. Plan, a step-by-step plan for phasing in the outcome. People need a clear idea for how they can get where they need to go. And part, you need to give each person a part to play in both the plan and the outcome. People need a tangible way to contribute and participate. What I found interesting when I did this research was how many parallels there were between the four stages, how much they had in common with the 4 stages and the 4 elements of the TCFD. And so one of my goals in this work is to draw these parallels and create a comprehensive climate change management communications blueprint for companies to use. And that's what we're going to be doing and publishing. So now let's discuss climate communications. The TCFD itself, so I'll just paint a picture for you. I don't need to tell you guys how fast this space is changing and how much material there is to read. And so many long weekend days have been spent in a conference room in my office with piles of paper and iPads and reading as much as I can. The TCFD itself publishes massive, massive amounts of information. I was reading through one of these documents actually in scenario analysis, and I came across this quote and I fell off my, all right, I didn't actually fall off my chair, but in my mind I fell off my chair. And it says, I quote, "It is essential to inform board members and senior management about the basics of climate change, its risk manifestations, and potential business implications for the company. Engagement is necessary to mobilize the involvement of business units and management throughout the company and overcome inertia and resistance." And I said, wow, this is a communications vehicle. I know PR gets a bad rap, but all these guys in finance, they're sitting there, some women, sitting there creating this model that is essentially a PR vehicle. It's essentially a communications vehicle, allowing companies to speak the same language and start moving toward climate change solutions. I like this quote. Okay, so one area where organizational change management aligns completely with the discipline of communications is in the knowledge of that different stakeholders may need different tools and angles to accept the message. And we're going to spend some time talking about these 3. We'll start with the most difficult one, the skeptic. And you may wonder why communicating to the skeptic matters, but it does. Even if you don't have a company full of skeptics, your customer cohort or your supply chain might have. And if we think back to the earlier slides that fighting climate change is going to take all of us, then we know we cannot leave anybody behind. The good news is that climate beliefs have shifted, but I'm English. I was practicing last night. My husband was like, partisanship. I was saying partisanship. He was like, what? What are you saying? Oh, I knew I was going to trip up on that one. The good news is that climate beliefs have shifted, but partisanship is still a strong factor in people's beliefs about climate change. It's more important to them than their level of knowledge or understanding. So that'll come as no surprise to you. But when it comes to moving the skeptic to action, these are very pertinent questions. Do beliefs really matter? Fundamentally. I don't know how many of you might have read the book Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. I have all of my team at Benecomms always read it. It's aged a bit, but fundamentally it talks about what's the science behind making ideas stick. And there's so many wonderful examples in there from brands and communities. This one in particular was an anti-littering campaign. They tried everything in Texas, and the littering was getting worse and worse, and then they tried the Don't Mess with Texas. I didn't know when I first moved to this country and heard that phrase, it actually arose from an anti-littering campaign, but it did. So just a tiny bit of information on the science behind communications. On average, we're exposed to 5,000 brand messages every day. We're aware of only about 86, with only 12 making a lasting impression. We don't have enough neural capacity to pay attention to all that surrounds us. As a result, we use subconscious signals in the form of feelings and thoughts created by emotion to alert us to pay attention. So contrary to what is generally believed, all decisions are in fact informed by emotion. We use motions both as an appraisal tool and a guide for behavior. When it comes to climate change, we have to be careful to remember this. Messages that overwhelm or make people feel helpless are likely to work against the cause. So how do we empower the skeptic? One way might be to let him know the inside scoop from corporate leaders around the world. These leaders are using data to understand their climate risks, to strategize to stay profitable, healthy, and competitive. Moreover, this fact may soon impact his ability to get insurance for his business. Maybe it will impact his retirement savings and more. Given this knowledge, how can he act to stay competitive, healthy, and successful? And then in terms of actions we might want him to take, voting is an obvious one, but that often sends the message back into the realm of political, which we don't really want to be there. It hasn't helped us very much, at least when it comes to communicating with the skeptic. But what we all know in this room is that every community, every business, every one of us is going to be impacted, no matter what we do from this moment on. Climate change is coming, and it's coming hard and fast. We need readiness. Every community needs readiness. So one of the actions we might want to take is readiness planning. It's necessary across the world. In a corporate setting, when you speak about strategy, climate change strategy, you're looking at all of these elements, and community action planning is very similar. You need business owners, you need government, you need insurance, you need first responders, healthcare. So if our skeptic is a fireman or a farmer or a hospital administrator or a church leader, he can play a critical role in protecting and readying his community. Thus, the concept of climate risk can become a catalyst for action outside of the realm of finance, where it was born. Now let's pivot to talk about the sustainability leader right there in the middle. There are so many things to say, so many tools. I only have 8 more minutes, so I'm just going to focus on one, and that is human resources. There simply are not enough people working in this field to enact the change management necessary. Here's what we're up against. This was a recent survey of business leaders asked anonymously what do they think, and the result wasn't pretty. By and large, they don't believe their organizations can do it. But as we know, failure is not an option. So what other industries can we look to model how this might work? Climate change is sometimes compared to cybersecurity in terms of the change management required. I'm old enough to remember when cybersecurity wasn't even a word or 2 words, at least not one that people outside of the computer industry knew. And then over the years, it became a huge risk, and huge departments were built up over it. You can see some statistics here. On the left is a study, Cisco Cyber Report, and on the right is a survey, very recent. We just got the data just a few days ago from a survey of our members, and this is Women in Climate Tech, about 200 leaders around the world. Now, the good news is we ran this same survey in February of this year, and this number was actually 39%. So it's gone up from 39% to 46%. Now, that number is large organizations that have more than 20 people working on climate change. The bad news is that overall, for all company sizes, only about 26% of companies have departments this size, and many of them don't have any. We have a lot of other data. Sitting in the press room, how many of them have the term climate change in their titles? How much access do they have to the C-suite? We asked lots of questions, and you're welcome to pick up copies of the information. But here's what's at stake, and this is just over the next 5 years. We have so many more people working in cybersecurity, but the financial risk of climate change swamps that of cybersecurity. So again, we just don't have enough people yet. Enter the swamped workers, our third category. As we discussed, workers from every department and every role need to be recruited to help. Yes, we need centralized sustainability departments, climate change people. We need climate change in people's titles, for goodness sakes. Like, this is what we're working on, right? We need to acknowledge this. But we also need to distribute the tasks across organizations, so we just aren't going to be able to train enough sustainability officers to make this happen fast enough. So how can the swamped workers be recruited? How can they be trained? And here's where organizational change management and communications come in. If you remember, these were my circles from before. And this is part of the science of managing transitions here. We'll start from the heart, the purpose. Leaders must communicate with purpose. They must take an unequivocal position on climate change, so there's no confusion in the ranks. Number 2, picture. Employees cannot be what they cannot see. Everyone needs a clear picture of what it means to devote some of their time on climate change. What does net zero actually mean to each worker? That picture needs to be painted. In our written materials, we discuss some of the ways of doing this. And there's a lot of different communication strategies, from touring other facilities and other companies, breaking down barriers, communicating between companies, between divisions. One strategy I wanted to mention that I think is brilliant, it's actually several sustainability officers I know have employed this, and that is publishing a glossary of terms throughout the company, so everyone understands what does TCFD mean? What is sustainability? Literal definition, so everyone can start speaking the same language. That's often a first step that companies are taking, and it can be very effective. Number 3, when it comes to planning, sustainability officers and everyone involved in the exercise should be steeped in the science of organizational change management. That's an important point. I was not trained as a sustainability officer per se, but I've taken a lot of different courses at different academic institutions, and also with a couple of associations. And I will say, in my experience, you spend the first few days learning all about climate change, and by the end of it, you feel like you want to jump out of a window. It's important to know the science. And then only a very, very small moment was spent on organizational change management, and that was when I came alive. I was like, I need to know more about this. This resonates with me. I understand this. This is what's not the most important, but this is where the rubber meets the road. So we need sustainability officers to have more training on this. When I started working on this field, very few business schools were actually teaching anything about climate change. And that's changing now, thank goodness. So I think the MBA schools can play a big role in that. Again, someone needs to write the book that I would like to read, and maybe I will be the one to do that. We'll see, that's the goal. And then finally, define and design. How can you redefine every job, everything from your job descriptions to your financial reporting to include climate? So I would recommend you guys subscribe to our Benecomms newsletter on benecomms.io. That's where we'll be publishing more details on all of these tips and tricks. And then finally, in summary, When it comes to change management, it's not necessarily about flattening the curve. It's about understanding it, and that you need huge investment of time and resources to navigate it. And that you understand climate change will force your hand and will derail you if you hesitate. So lean into the curve and do it now. Thank you.